The way we're going to structure tonight is that first of all, Jeremy is going to speak, and then Haim is going to speak. Let me introduce Jeremy first, and I'll also introduce Haim, so you have an idea who he is before he speaks with us. So Jeremy is professionally the head of Israel studies at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, lives in Jerusalem. Many of us have seen the interior of his flat several times since the pandemic began, because he's been helping us to understand what's going on in Israel during the pandemic time over the and even took us on a trip around the border places of Israel a couple of months ago, next Sunday in Jerusalem. And we really appreciate what you're doing for us, Jeremy, helping us to know. I do need to ask everybody to stay on mute, because otherwise you will be heard saying to the person next to you, I can't believe what you just said, or whatever it might be. Jeremy will tell you, I'm sure, a little bit more about his full connection to Israel. But for anybody who doesn't know, also Jeremy is the son of our former Rabbi Michael Leigh, Zichrono Livracha, and also therefore very much part of the EHRS family in that way. Haim, meanwhile, is from Manchester, as you will hear. Haim Shalom. He was an RS Weinik of great activity growing up, and like Jeremy, made Aliyah as a young man, which he still is, even if he doesn't look quite as young as he once did. Since he has been in Israel, Haim gained semicha from Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, the college in which Jeremy teaches, and then he has been a rabbi and is rabbi currently in Mevakshei Derech synagogue, which is one of the 5 Reform synagogues in Jerusalem. Right. Got our background noise there. Just thank you. That to go. Let me just see where that is. That's gone. Thank you very much indeed. He's the rabbi of Mevakshei Derech synagogue in Jerusalem, which is one of the 5 progressive synagogues in Jerusalem. For a while, some of you may recognize him because he and his family came here to Britain for, I think it was 3 years. Is that right? Or was it slightly more than that?
2 years.
2 years to be rabbi of Menorah Synagogue in Cheshire, in Manchester, and then returned back on Aliyah to Israel. So I think that's probably all you need to know to get started with. As Joe has pointed out, and it is important that as well as being Michael's son, Jeremy is also Sonia Leigh's son, and especially if Sonia joins us tonight, we must make sure that that is mentioned, especially because that's what we were doing to make sure that she was able to if she wished to. So let me now hand over to Jeremy, and he's going to begin. We thank you both very much for being with us. I'm going to spotlight him so we can all see him properly.
Thank you, Mark, and hello to everyone this evening. It's there is something a little bit surreal, I think, about this as a setup. You know, at least I'll say for myself, you know, one of the joys of the last year or so in an otherwise quite grim period has been the opportunity to connect and in a way probably reconnect with the EHRS and through Mark and through the various programs we've done. And it feels sort of, I don't know, it's sad. It's challenging to be doing this on in the middle of a conflict, and that's kind of what we're in. And I do want to just say one thing, by the way, which not looking for the melodrama at all, but I will say that, because professionally my job, I'm responsible for the Israel Studies program for trainee rabbis who are mainly coming from the United States and Canada, who come who have to do their first year in Israel. And therefore, not surprisingly, part of our conversation is really to put in front of them the question of where does Israel fit in your Jewish identity and in your life? And hopefully, in an interesting and engaged, critical, but supportive kind of way. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And but in a way, when Mark called me yesterday, I think, and said, would you do this? My first reaction was, I think, just to say that, really a thank you, really to Rabbi Mark, because for me, it's not taken for granted that all Jewish communities around the world and not in the Reform movement, in a way, want to connect to what's going on here with whatever our views are. And I think, this invitation for me is a real, I take as a real, sign of strength and a sign of solidarity and connectedness. And I appreciate it very much. And I appreciate everyone for showing up. It's interesting. I'm going to say give a few brief thoughts, a little bit about, what's going on for me and my family, and a little bit, maybe a few thoughts on the situation. And then I'm sure Chaim will offer some thoughts as well. And then obviously, you can push it in whichever direction you want to go in when we come to the questions. I made Aliyah in 1992. Just as the new government in Israel had just been elected, and the first part of my time in Israel was spent very much, in the glow of the Oslo Accords and the period that was supposed to kind of usher in peace in the Middle East. And I will say that, that was in the 90s, and in a different century. 2 of my 3 daughters were born in that era. But sadly, the period, from, well, certainly the last 20 years has seen the slow move away from that. And the reason I reference it is that whenever these things flare up, and please God, it is no more than a flare up, that it will calm down and there will be a ceasefire and goals will be achieved and we'll be able to, look for better ways of, dealing with our issues here. You're all the time asking, is this detracting from the possibility of a better Middle East? Or is this, another slide into something which is terribly negative? And I think for me, that challenge has always been there between this macro, what's going on and what does it mean? And then the very personal story. The personal story, whatever, I've got my versions of them. And I know for sure that you've all got your versions of this in one way or another. When things flare up here, it means something to you. I can't lie. I'm looking at the screen and I know many of you, and I've got this strong memory from the Yom Kippur War of when when we found out about what was going on then, and we were in shul and I was 8, and whatever. It's dramatic and it's hard and it's very painful, and therefore that sense of being connected starts with the personal. What do we feel individually for ourselves? In a way, the sirens went off the other night, the other afternoon, and on the whole, missiles coming from Gaza rarely come to Jerusalem because, the assumption is that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are wary of attacking Jerusalem for fear of anything happening to the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount in the Old City. But there was so much drama on Monday, which was Yom Yerushalayim, with a powder keg feeling of tensions building in Jerusalem, that I have to say, the one thing I did not expect was that was going to happen. And anyway, the point is the siren went off, and whatever. It's not and I've shared this before. I'm disabled. I get around with walking sticks and a mobility scooter. The shelter in my building is 5 floors down. So after about 5 minutes of I got down, I think 1 flight of stairs, and the siren's still going off, and I could hear the booms coming of the Iron Dome trying to knock the thing out. I mean, in the end, it didn't land anywhere near me, but I just kind of thought, oh God, this is ridiculous. If the missile's going to land, the missile's going to land, but it kind of sent a kind of a thing going through my mind, which is that normal or is that abnormal? And this question of abnormality for me is what this is about. Again, I think this is not I don't think there's there may be a distinct, but I don't think it's a unique question to ask. All of you, if you're on this call, clearly are connected to something. When you heard about this conflict, is it just more of the same of something we've had before, or is it abnormal? Is it singular? Is it different? So for me, I think, the first thing that happens is, ringing around all my family to check that everyone's okay. I was the only one in the apartment. Currently only my middle daughter is in Jerusalem. My wife's here. She was actually driving back from Tel Aviv where she teaches. But then the thing sort of escalated. And I will say that from the thing that has more occupied us for the last 72 hours has been my youngest daughter, who's studying on she's going to the army in the summer, and she's on a pre-army study program at Kibbutz Cholit, which is right down on the end of the southern point of the Gaza border by Kerem Shalom, the crossing point. And for the last 72 hours, all she's been doing has been running to the shelter. And she works in the kindergarten there. Part of her volunteer work. And she's been working with, with different families, sort of trying to help out as well, even not during kindergarten time. And, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, what on earth is this about? My 19-year-old daughter is has in some way normalized the experience of running in and out of a shelter with sirens blaring all the time. And, you know, she slept in the shelter. She's basically been in the shelter the last 72 hours. And only today, during a sort of a period of calm, they actually moved everybody to a different place. And fielding conversations with my daughter, I have to say, for me, has been the most kind of pertinent version of what's gone on this time. I mean, when the sirens went off the other night in Tel Aviv, in the center of the country, in some way, all my friends who are largely speaking my age, a little bit older, a little bit younger, but basically they're all climbing into shelters or, you know, or whatever, sheltered rooms, secure rooms. Some of them haven't cleared the shelter out since the last time, so they're climbing into a broom cupboard. I mean, you know, there's humor behind it. But the conversation with my daughter, for me, has in a way brought most of this close to home, a feeling of, you know what, this isn't actually me and my life story and my choices. This is actually about my kids. And unlike my older two, who've both finished the army and in a way feel a little bit more in touch, for her, this has been, I would say, sort of traumatic. I mean, I don't think there's any other real way around it. She had an early experience in 2014 when a missile came and she was sort of strapped in the back of the car. And I think that left a bit of trauma sitting up there. And this has been kind of really quite a difficult, very, very difficult time. So, you know, in terms, Mark said, you know, just to sort of say, to share a little bit of about what's happening, you know, for me, that's one part. Very, very briefly, before I pass it over to Chaim, I think there are two other things that I wanted to point out. Actually, I don't feel particularly scared. As I say, I don't think I live in a particularly dangerous area. The neighborhood I live in is quite dangerous. We border on one village, a Palestinian village, which generally speaking is quite hostile. But I have a friend from the neighborhood and from the village, and he says, no, I think you're going to be okay. So I'll take his word. But it's much more watching some of the reaction on the streets of Israel. You know, every conflict, something else flares up. And, you know, I think now, and again, depending on which BBC you report or ITV or whichever newspaper you read, you'll either get more of the story from Gaza and Hamas and less of the other one, or the other way around. This conflict has ignited tensions between Jews and Arabs inside Israel to the most frightening degree. 2 nights ago, we saw an attempted lynch of somebody Jewish in Lud, in the center of the country. We saw a horrifying picture of synagogues being attacked and somebody coming out of the synagogue holding Sifrei Torah. I mean, these are images that we see from a different period of history. Last night, we saw a group of radicalized, I think, fascistic, far-right Jews attacking Arabs and Arab shops in Bat Yam and in other places. And I saw political activists piling in. And the news story, in a way, has been very much about this kind of breakdown of the civil sort of contract, I guess, or the relations, sort of the souring of relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. And, you know, in a way, I mean, I'm setting it up there because I invite any of you to comment on it, but which do I find the more scary? You know, we can protect ourselves from missiles. We have an army and we have shelters and we have safe rooms, but protecting yourself from racism and prejudice and, you know, civil unrest, that's much harder to protect against. That's about education and investment and lots of other things as well. And that is one which I fear is with us. Tonight, the scenes are really quite shocking. I think a lot more of the violence today has come from the Arab sector against Jews, but, you know, I'm not under any illusions that, you know, we are all caught up in this. There is a really horrible bit of tension going on there. And the last thing I'll say, and this sort of just to kind of, I'm not doing a full-blown analysis. If you want to ask, then certainly feel free, and I will certainly try and fill in from the knowledge of what I can. I think there are things that triggered this particular round. I think that the actual fighting itself is actually already distantly connected to the trigger. The trigger might have been about Yom Yerushalayim. It may have been about actions on the Temple Mount. It may have been about evictions or potential evictions from an Arab neighborhood in East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah. But actually, I think the conflict I think from everything that I can read and understand, that actually Hamas and Islamic Jihad are piggybacking on the back of that to achieve other goals. So it's not about those things, it's about all of that. Just before I came on, there was a news flash which said that 3 rockets came across on the northern border from potentially from Hezbollah. Now, it turns out maybe, I mean, the news is currently saying that they're not from Hezbollah, but nonetheless, my oldest daughter lives on that border. Her back garden is the border, and she sees a Hezbollah flag at the top of the hill. She's studying social work in Tel Chai College in Kiryat Shmona, but she lives in Metula. And that's really very, very, very worrying indeed. And that's the bit where we sort of say, there are these circles, concentric circles going outwards of understanding what's going on. From me with my faulty legs to my, daughter with with her kids in the whatever on the kibbutz, going out to the kind of the question of Hamas or maybe civil unrest in the country, going all the way out to the question of the region. And that I think is I don't know. I'm going to pause it on that, and obviously feel free to pick up and comment and ask and give your own thoughts on it. But I think that for me is, the bit that is worrying everybody this evening, which is, are we able to control this, to contain it? If we can just keep it close to something that's about us and Hamas, that's pretty bad anyway. But we don't want it to spread any further. There is possibly talk of a ground invasion into Gaza. That will prolong this conflict for a very long time and cause a lot of loss of life. But like the question mark that hangs over the northern border, I think one doesn't want to go there because we're not actually in it yet. So a bit of personal and a bit of political, a bit of micro, a bit of macro. I'm going to pause it there and pass it back over to Mark and Chaim.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for getting us started. We also welcome to Sonia, who's come to join us, and also to our Emeritus Rabbi Danny Smith, who's also with us tonight. Let me now pass over to Chaim, who, as I said, is the Rabbi of Mevakshei Derech Synagogue in Jerusalem, one of 5 Reform synagogues in Jerusalem. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, Chaim. I'm now going to put a spotlight on you.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with Edgware and Hendon. It's wonderful to be here. I don't have the EHRS pedigree that Jeremy has, obviously, but I have a number of connections. I grew up at Jackson's Row Synagogue in Manchester, and my rabbi grew up at Edgware, Rabbi Reuven Silverman. And so I may not have grown up as the son of an Edgware rabbi, but as the congregant of one at least. And I certainly owe a great deal to Rabbi Danny and Hanny Smith, who kind of saved me and took me in when I was a struggling first-year university student in London. So it's a good opportunity for me to say thank you again to Danny, and hope he passes that on to Hanny. And as I look around and see some familiar faces and names, I'm reminded that Edgware and Hendon have a very long history of being very supportive of Israel. And it's not surprising that you have, such a good turnout, because you have, a community committed to this country, which is shown by the very fact that I know, I imagine Rabbi Danny is very worried about his own grandchildren in Modi'in, who are certainly in, at this point in time, in a place a little bit more dangerous than Jerusalem in terms of rocket fire. I imagine they've spent time in their safe room or whatever, and I'm sure that's been very worrying, and I'm guessing there are plenty of others of you on this call who have other family members in Israel. I'm in a relatively, I feel like I'm in a relatively lucky position being in Jerusalem. We did have a very scary Monday afternoon, evening, where at 6 o'clock we heard sirens, and maybe because I'm not so linked into the news, I didn't know to expect this in any way. It took me completely by surprise, and we were standing there saying, what's going on? It's just not something that Jerusalemites think will happen. We've told ourselves the nice story that, Hamas won't fire on Jerusalem because they'd be too scared to hit Palestinian population areas or Palestinian holy sites. But nevertheless, there it was, and there we were. And I think I'll go a little bit more on the personal, because I think Jeremy's much more qualified to talk in the analytical terms. I was with children significantly younger than Jeremy's. My kids are aged 11, 8, and 4. My oldest is autistic and struggled to understand what was going on. And my 4-year-old was also a little bit, too young to understand. She was primarily interested in the popcorn, more than the video that we put on to calm everyone down as we gathered in our safe room. The popcorn was the great treat for her. But my 8-year-old was obviously quite scared. And at that moment, I realized what I think I knew was always going to be coming, which is that once you choose to live in this country, and I guess chosen that twice, having moved here in 2002 originally, very different from Jeremy, who moved here in 1992 in a surge of optimism. I moved in 2002, which was the height of the Second Intifada, moved on to Emek Rephaim, one of the main thoroughfares of South Jerusalem. And shortly after I moved there, a couple of restaurants got blown up there whilst I was a few feet away. So I came at potentially the worst possible time for violence in Jerusalem. And so that obviously had made me realize that the reality of living here, even though, I say that and it's not really been the reality. Very shortly after I came, I was obviously the harbinger of peace for this particular, for that particular flare up, and the Second Intifada died down as soon as I came to sort everyone out. And actually, despite living in a place that many people think of as a war zone, despite serving in the army during a war, the reality isn't that we live in fear. And yet here I was with an 8-year-old daughter, and she was scared. And we needed to work out, what do you say to an 8-year-old to explain why are we hiding out in a reinforced room? And the reality that presented was one that obviously makes you question your choices. Why did I sign up my kids for this? And one that makes you, at the same time, to some extent, recommit to those choices. What was true in 2002 when I had no children is still true now, nearly 20 years later, with 3 children. This is the place I believe I need to be. I was brainwashed and indoctrinated by Jeremy. I get to, that kind of thing. I get to brainwash and indoctrinate another generation of people to believe that, this is the best place to be Jewish. The things that we love about Jewish community here happen on a national level. I came to Israel in 1996 to 97 on a post-high school year program. I was lucky enough to be assigned to Jeremy and his partner. They were my adoptive family. They weren't stupid enough to let me babysit their then 1-year-old daughter, who was their firstborn. But I got to see her as a 1-year-old, and now she's post-army, and it's my kids who are the little toddlers. And I really don't know how to explain to my children why I made this choice to be here. My daughter understands that we chose to be here. She actually was born in those 2 years we were back in Manchester. She and I have a bond because we were both born in Manchester, a particular bond. Obviously, I have a bond with all my kids, I hope. And I don't know how to explain them. But the thing that is much harder to explain is how not to transfer from fear, which is natural in that situation, to the desire for revenge. The day after we went into our safe room, my daughter came back from school, and it was obvious that they'd been talking about it at school, not necessarily with the teachers, but amongst the children. And my daughter said something I'd never heard from her before. which is, why do they want to hurt us? How do you explain to an 8-year-old why people are firing rockets on you? How do you explain to an 8-year-old why people are firing rockets on you without causing that 8-year-old to hate those people who fire rockets on you? How do we, this is in the very minutiae of within a family. How do you stop the cycle of hate? It's not easy. I don't have the answers. I desperately want to raise children who will be able to have the complex and nuanced conversations that Jeremy is so great at running with communities like your own, and which I've been a part of, around, how do we hold all these pieces? How do we recognize that, yes, of course, there's no excuse for rockets, but we also have to understand, the part played by Prime Minister Netanyahu in deliberately inciting the Palestinian masses through not allowing them to vote in Jerusalem as part of the Palestinian elections, and stopping people being able to use the Damascus Gate to access the Al-Aqsa Mosque for Ramadan. All the things that were done, and the complexity, and how do you explain the humiliation of living under occupation, etc., etc. That's too much nuance for an 8-year-old. All I need to do is work out how to teach her not to hate. Because hate and revenge is the natural corollary of fear. Fear is the core, and the klipa, the outside piece, is revenge. When you feel fear, you want to take revenge against those people who cause you to feel that. I don't have answers, and I don't know really what to tell the people who love us so much that they're willing to devote their evenings to listening to us from Edgware, and who are tied to this place despite being far away. And I'm sure, as I say, I'm sure many of you have family and friends here, and you care deeply about them and you worry deeply about them. I don't have answers. The questions that bother me most, as Jeremy said, are, what's this doing to our society? There's no question the rockets are terrible, but we can deal with them. The potential for deterioration of everything we've built here, that we see in the violence between thugs on both sides, that is truly scary. And that's the poison that could destroy my family as well as my society. And that really scares me. Mark, you need to unmute.
I do. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed, Haim. So thank you to Haim and Jeremy. A couple of introductory things before we open things out. First of all, as you'll see, my virtual background is as if I'm standing on a street corner in Tel Aviv. And I think that, that's deliberately chosen. In some ways, I want us to think that way. It's a tough place to put ourselves because we're not there. We are in Edgware, Bushy, Bournemwood, Finchley, and all around. But as if you were talking to each other on a street corner in the Jewish state is one way that perhaps we can have this conversation. It's going to be frustrating because it's going to be too short, which is completely fine. And that's because this does not have to be the last conversation. I'm sure we will have more. So it will be short, inevitably. As Chaim warned us, it can't really be an evening of answers, but my goodness, it could be an evening of questions. And we heard from both Jeremy and from Chaim this question of what is more worrying, what's happening within Israel, or what's happening from Gaza to Israel and vice versa. And that seems to be an important question. And I also, as they say, we recognize that for many of us, this is deeply personal. This is our family, our friends that we're talking about as well. I also want to know, I want to make sure that people are aware that among the people who are here, and I'm really delighted you're here, is Gideon Futterman. And Gideon, I don't mean to embarrass you, but Gideon is in the situation where he's teaching some of our young children in Cheder. And I know that the sessions that he's doing is called Israel, It's Complicated. We need to help them to understand Israel. So, please, if anybody wants to jump forwards with a question, you're most welcome, because you're going to have to deal with this on Sunday morning. So my suggestion is 2 ways of asking questions. One of them is waving. The other way is popping it in the chat, and then I'll ask you to ask your question. And I know that we have a first one from Kay, and this can be questions and it can also be discussion. I will jot things down as I see hands waving, and I will say that I'm seeing them, so don't worry. So I see Stuart's enthusiastic hand waving, which is grand, and Lawrence K. So we're going to just start with those 3. This is going to be frustrating because we're not going to get the chance to do everything, but we can come back again. I'm now also going to turn off the recording so that we can feel very free in the questions that we ask, and we know it's not being recorded for posterity. So first of all, thank you so much to Haim and Jeremy for getting us started. And I'm going to stop the cloud recording.